Hello, and welcome back to Muse Reads Tolkien. We'll give it a few minutes before we start while I update the settings. There it is. Good morning, Destructive Criticism. Thanks for joining us. My settings couldn't be saved. What are you talking about? Let's see here. Okay, good. I did what I wanted. Alright, let's take a look at this. Hopefully everyone's doing well. Let's see here. Of course. Check this. Just fixing a couple things that YouTube messed up, because of course YouTube messed up. We'll get started in a few minutes once folks have popped in. I'm gonna run and refill my water, and then we should be good to go. Hello Akatsuki, Zul, Nacho, welcome. Be right back. Pippin, what are you doing? Alright. Come here. Are you causing chaos? Come on. Ugh. Alrighty. Hope everyone's doing well. It's been, what, did we read this last Wednesday? The last time? Yes, that's a good tagline for this, Akatsuki. Let's see, last time we were dealing with, how the various dwarf and elf groups developed over time, and what they were all doing while the other elf groups were having their squabbles in the Godland. So now the two elf groups, Fëanor and his family, and Fingolfin and his family, are in Middle-earth again, because they decided to go on this quest for revenge. And Middle-earth has its own groups, the dwarfs chilling in their caves, Thingol and Melian chilling in their cave, and the ocean dudes, ocean elves, chilling by the ocean. The rest of Middle-earth has basically been taken over by Melkor, Morgoth. He's more goth than you. As he tried to wage war, and the elves and dwarfs, they tried to fight him, and kind of succeeded in pushing him back a little bit, but eventually they all had to retreat to their own homes and kind of hide, because the amount of fighting was just overwhelming. So they're all hiding in their caves and retreating, and that's when Fëanor and them show up. But now we're taking another detour to describe how men first arrived. The human race are going to be introduced to the universe for the first time. Surely that will go well. Surely that won't cause problems for anyone. When have people ever caused problems? Never. So this is chapter 12 of Men. The Valar sat now behind their mountains at peace, and having given light to Middle-earth, they left it for long unattended. And the lordship of Morgoth was uncontested save by the valor of the Noldor. Most in mind Ulmo kept the exiles, who gathered news of the earth through all the waters. From this time forth were reckoned the years of the sun. Swifter and briefer are they than the long years of the trees in Valinor. In that time the air of Middle-earth became heavy with the breath of growth and mortality, and the changing and aging of all things was hastened exceedingly. Life teemed upon the soil and in the waters in the second spring of Arda, and the Eldar increased, and beneath the new sun Beleriand grew green and fair. Beleriand being the country we're basically dealing with. It's like above... It's above Middle-earth, I think. I don't know if Middle-earth and Beleriand are the same. They're kind of, like, you think about, like, North America and Canada and the United States and Mexico are all connected and they're part of the same continent, but they're separate, countries. I think that's kind of what Beleriand and Middle-earth are. That's how I always imagine them. Same continent, two separate parts, separated by, like, mountains. At the first rising of the sun, the younger children of Ilúvatar awoke in the land of Hildorian, in the eastward regions of Middle-earth. But the first sun arose in the west, and the opening eyes of men were turned towards it, and their feet as they wandered over the earth for the most part strayed that way. The Atani they were named by the Eldar, the second people, and they called them also Hildor, the followers, and many other names, Apananar, the afterborn, Engwar, the sickly, and Firamar, the mortals. And they named them the usurpers, the strangers, and the inscrutable, the self-cursed, the heavy-handed, the night-fearers, the children of the sun. Of men little is told in these tales, which concern the eldest days before the waxing of mortals and the waning of the elves, save of those fathers of men, the Atanari. No. Atanatari. The Atanatari, who in the first years of the sun and moon wandered into the north of the world. Till Hildorian there came no Vala to guide men, or to summon them to dwell in Valinor. And men have feared the Valar, rather than loved them, and have not understood the purposes of the powers, being at variance with them, and at strife with the world. So unlike the elves that awoke in this place, and then the gods showed up and said, "Hey, peace, how you doing? Come hang out with us." The men were never greeted by the Valar, and so they still fear them and see them as like very alien creatures. They awoke and traveled, what did he say, northward, westward, from a land called Hildorian? Yes, Hildorian. So from now on, this group of men will probably mostly be called the Hildors, Hildor. They're the first group of men that all other groups will kind of be descendants of. He gave them a whole fuck ton of names. I would just remember Hildor, because I'm pretty sure that's the group name that the first clan of men will use the most. Alright. Ulmo nonetheless took thought for them, aiding the counsel and will of Manwë, and his messages came often to them by stream and flood. But they have not skill in such matters, and still less had they in those days before they had mingled with the elves. Therefore they loved the waters, and their hearts were stirred, but they understood not the messages. Yet it is told that ere long they met dark elves in many places, and were befriended by them, and men became the companions and disciples in their childhood of these ancient folk wanderers of the elven race, who never set out upon the paths of Valinor, and knew of the Valar only as a rumor and a distant name. So the elves that the humans first become friends with are the ones that never went to Valinor, the ones that wander the woods and just kind of do their own thing. So they learn how to be human, be alive from these wilderness elves who are wild and free. Kind of starting a theme here of the humans are wild and free and they do what they want, fuck everybody. Fuck everybody else. And of course, well, yeah, he probably imagined them all as white. I don't know that he describes skin tone very much. I feel like in his brain, he probably defaulted always to lighter skin, unless he specified. But in addition, his not specifying kind of allows for interpretation. There's one group I remember him specifying as being dark-skinned, other than, like, orcs. And that's one clan of the hobbits. What clan? One of the clans of the hobbits was described as being as brown as the dirt that they worked in. And one of the main hobbits is a descendant of that clan, if I remember right. I do not remember. We'll get to it at some point in these stories. I don't remember where it was, but that's the one time I remember him describing skin tone as dark that was not an orc. Or a southerner, what's his face. Okay. Morgoth had then not long come back into Middle-earth, and his power went not far abroad, and was moreover checked by the sudden coming of great light. There was little peril in the lands and hills, and there new things, devised long ages before in the thought of Yavanna, and sown as seed in the dark, came at last to their budding and their bloom. West, north, and south, the children of men spread and wandered, and their joy was the joy of the morning before the dew is dry, when every leaf is green. But the dawn is brief, and the day full often belies its promise. And now the time drew on the great wars of the powers of the north, when Noldor and Sindar and men strove against the hosts of Morgoth Boglir, and went down in ruin. To this end the cunning lies of Morgoth that he sowed of old, and sowed ever anew among his foes, and the curse that came of the slaying at Aqualonde and the oath of Fëanor were ever at work. Only a part is here told of those deeds of those days, and most is said of the Noldor and the Silmarils, and the mortals that became entangled in their fate. In those days elves and men were of a like stature and strength of body, but the elves had greater wisdom and skill and beauty, and those who had dwelt in Valinor and looked upon the powers as much surpassed the dark elves in these things, as they in turn surpassed the people of mortal race. Only in the realm of Doriath, whose queen Melian was of the kindred of Valar, did the Sindar come near to match the Calaquendi of the Blessed Realm. Haradrim, that's who they were. Thank you, Akatsuki. Those are the southern folks. So basically he's saying humans showed up and they did their own thing for a little while, but shit's gonna go down soon and there's gonna be a big old war and they'll be involved and it will suck. We haven't actually gotten to all that yet. He's just kind of foreshadowing that shit's coming. Immortal were the elves, and their wisdom waxed from age to age, and no sickness nor pestilence brought death to them. Their bodies indeed were of the stuff of earth and could be destroyed, and in those days they were more like to the bodies of men, since they had not so long been inhabited by the fire of their spirit, which consumes them from within in the courses of time. But men were more frail, more easily slain by weapon or mischance, and less easily healed, subject to sickness and many ills, and they grew old and died. What may befall their spirit after death, the elves know not. Some say that they too go to the halls of Mandos, but their place of waiting there is not that of the elves, and Mandos under Ilúvatar alone, save Manwë knows, whether they go out after the time of recollection in those silent halls beside the outer sea. None have ever come back from the mansions of the dead, save only Beren, son of Barahir, whose hand had touched a Silmaril, but he never spoke afterward to mortal men. The fate of men after death, maybe, is not in the hands of the Valar, nor was all foretold in the music of the Ainur. So basically, when men died, we don't know where their souls go. In after days, when because of the triumph of Morgoth, elves and men became estranged, as he most wished, those of the elven race that lived still in Middle-earth waned and faded, and men usurped the sunlight. Then the Quendi wandered in the lonely places of the great lands and the isles, and took to the moonlight and the starlight, and to the woods and caves, becoming as shadows and memories, save those who ever and anon set sail into the west and vanished from Middle-earth. But in the dawn of years, elves and men were allies and held themselves akin, and there were some among men that learned the wisdom of the Eldar, and became great and valiant among the captains of the Noldor. And in the glory and beauty of the elves and in their fate, full share had the offspring of elf and mortal, Arendil and Elwing, and Elrond their child. My boy Elrond. So you'll probably recognize his name. He is the elf from The Lord of the Rings. He rules the Rivendell, and he's all cool and stuff. And he's half human. He is the reason that he has dark brown hair and darker features. I've always imagined the half-human elves as having darker skin. I don't know why. That's always how I saw it. I guess because he describes all the fancy blonde elves as being so fair. So I always imagined the dark hair elves as having darker skin. He doesn't really specify, but anyway, there's a group of elves that are descendants of the kind of mix of human and elf. So they're a little more human. Elrond's one of them. His kids, there's a couple others, but the one that stands out the most is Elrond. And he had a brother who chose to be mortal. Cannot remember his name, but anyway. So now we're going to jump to chapter 13, where we're going to jump back to discussing the Noldor, the group of elves that fucked up a lot and decided to leave for Middle-earth to try and get revenge because their king was murdered, their treasures were stolen, Fëanor's pissed. This is how they come to Middle-earth. Chapter 13 of The Return of the Noldor. It has been told that Fëanor and his sons came first of the exiles to Middle-earth, and landed in the wastes of Lemoth, the Great Echo, upon the outer shores of the Firth of Drengist. And even as the Noldor set foot upon the strand, their cries were taken up into the hills and multiplied, so that a clamor as of countless mighty voices filled all the coasts of the north. And the noise of the burning of the ships at Losgar went down the winds of the sea, as a tumult of great wrath, and far away all who heard that sound were filled with wonder. Now the flames of that burning were seen not only by Fingolfin, whom Fëanor had deserted in Araman, but also by the orcs and the watchers of Morgoth. No tale has told what Morgoth thought in his heart at the tidings that Fëanor, his bitterest foe, had brought a host out of the west. It may be that he feared him little, for he had as yet no proof of the swords of the Noldor, and soon it was seen that he proposed to drive them back into the sea. Under the cold stars, before the rising of the moon, and the host of Fëanor went up the long Firth of Drengist, that pierced the echoing hills of Ered Loman, and passed thus from the shore into the great land of Hithlum. And they came at length to the long lake of Mithrim, and upon its northern shore made their encampment in the region that bore the same name. But the host of Morgoth, aroused by the tumult of Lameth and the light of the burning at Losgar, came through the passes of Ered Wethrin, the mountains of shadow, and assailed Fëanor on a sudden, before his camp was full wrought in defense. Okay, so those are lots of place names. Lots and lots of place names. It might be good to have a map of Beleriand up if you'd like. Basically, they landed, they traveled to a lake, and they started building a camp, and Morgoth said, no, 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 and he came down out of the mountains and decided to attack them. There on the grey fields of Mithrim was fought the second battle in the wars of Beleriand. Dagor Nuin Gileath. It is named, the Battle Under Stars, for the moon had not yet risen, and it is renowned in song. The Noldor, outnumbered and taken unawares, were yet swiftly victorious, for the light of Aman was not yet dimmed in their eyes, and they were strong and swift, and deadly in anger, and their swords were long and terrible. The orcs fled before them, and they were driven forth from Mithrim with great slaughter, and hunted over the mountains of shadow into the great plains of Ardgalan that lay northward of Dorthonion. There the armies of Morgoth that had passed south into the Vale of Sirion and beleaguered Círdan in the havens of the Falus came up to their aid and were caught in their ruin. For Celegorm, Fëanor's son, having news of them, waylaid them with a part of the elven host, and coming down upon them out of the hills near Ethel Cinrion, drove them into the fen of Serech. This is all just describing battles and where they happened and where the troops were moved. Like, these troops were south and they came up and they went. So don't let the very many place names confuse you. This is just how the pieces moved on the map. Evil indeeds were the tidings that came at last to Angband, and Morgoth was dismayed. 10 days that battle lasted, and from it returned of all the hosts that he had prepared for the conquest of Beleriand, no more than a handful of leaves. Yet cause he had for great joy, though it was hidden from him for a while. For Fëanor, in his wrath against the enemy, would not halt, but pressed on behind the remnants of the orcs, thinking so to come at Morgoth himself. and he laughed aloud as he wielded his sword, rejoicing that he had dared the wrath of the Valar and the evils of the road, that he might see the hour of his vengeance. Nothing did he know of Angband, or the great strength of defense that Morgoth had so swiftly prepared. But even had he known, it would not have deterred him, for he was fey, consumed by the flame of his own wrath. Thus it was that he drew far ahead of the van of his host, and seeing this, the servants of Morgoth turned to bay, and there issued from Angband Balrogs to aid them. There upon the confines of Dor Daedaloth, the land of Morgoth, Fëanor was surrounded with few friends around him. Long he fought on and undismayed, though he was wrapped in fire and wounded with many wounds. But at the last he was smitten to the ground by Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, whom Ecthelion after slew in Gondolin. There he would have perished, had not his sons in that moment come up with force to his aid, and the Balrogs left him and departed to Angband. Then his sons raised up their father, and bore him back towards Mithram. But as they drew over to Ethel-Sirion, and were upon the upward path to the pass over the mountains, Fëanor bade them halt, for his wounds were mortal, and he knew that his hour was come. And looking out from the slopes of Eredwethin with his last sight, he beheld far off the peaks of Thangorodrim, mightiest of the towers of Middle-earth, and knew with the foreknowledge of death that no power of the Noldor would ever overthrow them. But he cursed the name of Morgoth thrice, and laid it upon his sons to hold to their oath and to avenge their father. Then he died, but he had neither burial nor tomb, for so fiery was his spirit, that as it sped his body fell to ash, and was borne away like smoke. And his likeness has never again appeared in Arda, neither has his spirit left the halls of Mandos. Thus ended the mightiest of the Noldor, of whose deeds came both their great renown and their most grievous woe. So he was so angry and so determined to have vengeance that he tried basically to assault the fortress by himself. Did not succeed. He just barely managed to not be killed on the battlefield because his sons finally came up and were able to save him, but his wounds were so grievous he knew that he was not going to live. He also realized, looking out upon the mountains that protected the fortress and the forces they'd fought, that there was no way they would ever win. And yet, he forced his sons to swear they would keep trying, even though he saw they would never win. The guy was so obsessed, so angry, he condemned his sons to death, basically. I mean, you know... But anyway, so they have sworn for a second time on their father's deathbed that they will carry out his vengeance. And I think it's going to go well, don't you? Hey, Marlon and Phil, and welcome, Kiriel. I hope I said your name right. Thanks for joining us. Alright, so Fëanor died. His sons, he has 7 of them, are going to continue the fight. And it's going to go great. I'm sure it'll be just fine. Now in Mithram there dwelt grey elves, folk of Beleriand that had wandered north over the mountains, and the Noldor met them with gladness, as kinsfolk long sundered. But speech at first was not easy between them, for in their long severance the tongues of the Calaquendi in Valinor and the Moraquendi in Beriland had drawn far apart. From the elves of Mithram the Noldor learned of the power of Elu Thingol, king in Doriath, and the girdle of enchantment that fenced this realm. And tidings of these great deeds in the north came south to Menegroth and to the havens of Berthombar and Elgarest. Then all the elves of Beleriand were filled with wonder and with hope at the coming of their mighty kindred, who thus returned unlooked for from the west in their very hour of need, believing indeed at first that they came as emissaries of the Valar to deliver them. So the group of Fëanor's kindred, the Noldor, who arrived in Middle-earth, have now met the elves that stayed in Middle-earth, the Grey Elves, and they're all like, oh, you guys have come to help us fight Morgoth the evil! You've come in our hour of need, been sent by the gods to help us! Not really what happened. The gods don't care about you, because that's them. And they have now, I guess, the 2 groups have been introduced, and we'll see how that goes. Hello, Dexy. Thanks for joining us. Even in the hour of the death of Fëanor, an embassy came to his sons from Morgoth, acknowledging defeat, and offering terms, even to the surrender of a Silmaril. Then Maedhros the Tall, the eldest son, persuaded his brothers to feign to treat with Morgoth, and to meet his emissaries at the place appointed. But the Noldor had as little thought of faith as had he. Wherefore each embassy came with greater force than was agreed. But Morgoth sent the more, and there were Balrogs. I love that sentence. And there were Balrogs! Just the implication. He doesn't have to say mighty monsters came to fight them. He just says, and there they were. There were the Balrogs. Maedhros was ambushed, and all his company was slain, but he himself was taken alive by the command of Morgoth and brought to Angband. I'm going to take a second. It's Pride Month. Happy Pride, everybody. Maedhros is going to end up one of the most popular and one of the gayest elves of Middle-earth. Gay fans of Middle-earth really like Maedhros, because we're about to, is it this part? If it's not this part, yes, it is this part, I think. He's gonna get rescued by another elf, and they are gonna have a lifelong bond of love that most people interpret as gay. Now, again, obviously, all these elves are technically related distantly, so it's kind of but, like, your mileage may vary, because even the elves that get married are related, because they're all descendant from the same guy, you know? So they're all, like, distant second cousins. Most people just kind of hand-wave it away, because none of them are actually raised as family. Hello, Jono, Julie. Thanks for joining us. Alright, so Maedhros was taken alive. That's important. He has been taken. The eldest son of Fëanor has been kidnapped. Then the brothers of Maedhros drew back and fortified a great camp in Hithlum, but Morgoth held Maedhros as hostage and sent word he would not release him unless the Noldor would forsake their war, returning into the west, or else departing far from Beleriand into the south of the world. But the sons of Fëanor knew that Morgoth would betray them, and would not release Maedhros, whatsoever they might do. And they were constrained also by their oath, and might not for any cause forsake the war against the enemy. Therefore Morgoth took Maedhros and hung him from the face of a precipice upon Thangorodrim, and he was caught to the rock by the wrist of his right hand with a band of steel. So, what he's done is he's tied Maedhros up to the mountains. He's hanging by his wrist from a cliff, the mountain wall that protects his fortress, and he's hanging on the outside of it. Now rumor came to the camp in Hithlum of the marching of Fingolfin and those that followed him, who had crossed the grinding ice, and all the world lay then in wonder at the coming of the moon. But as the host of Fingolfin marched into Mithrim, the sun rose flaming in the west, and Fingolfin unfurled his blue and silver banners and blew his horn, and flowers sprang beneath his marching feet, and the ages of the stars were ended. At the uprising of the great light, the servants of Morgoth fled into Angband, and Fingolfin passed unopposed through the fastness of Dor-Daedaloth, while his foes hid beneath the earth. Then the elves smote upon the gates of Angband, and the challenge of their trumpets shook the towers of Thangorodrim. And Maedhros heard them amid his torment, and cried aloud, but his voice was lost in the echoes of storm. So the second group of Noldor elves, the ones that Fëanor abandoned, who crossed the ice, they have arrived, and Fingolfin, their king, is badass. And is like, I'm awesome! You know, he was the equal of Fëanor, kind of, sort of. He wasn't as fiery, but he's very badass. And everybody runs in fear, because he's here. Alright. But Fingolfin, being of other temper than Fëanor, and wary of the wiles of Morgoth, withdrew from Dor-Daedaloth and turned back toward Mithrim, for he had heard tidings that there he should find the sons of Fëanor, and he desired also to have the shield of the Mountains of Shadow, while his people rested and grew strong. For he had seen the strength of Angband, and thought not that it would fall to the sound of trumpets only. So unlike Fëanor, he doesn't fight to the death, like an idiot. He says, we're not winning, we should go. Therefore, coming at the length to Hithlum, he made his first camp, and dwelling by the northern shores of Lake Mithrim. No love was there in the hearts of those that followed Fingolfin for the house of Fëanor, for the agony of those that endured the crossing of the ice had been great, and Fingolfin held the sons the accomplices of their fathers. Now let me double check this. One of the sons spoke up and said, hey dad, don't do that. So the reason they're angry is because they both teamed up to go to the west and fight Morgoth together. But when Fëanor crossed over in the boats, he was so angry and distrusting. He never liked his half-brother. So instead of sending the boats back for them, he burnt them so that he abandoned them in the west. And so they were like, well, what the fuck? Now we have to walk. So they walked across the ice. A lot of people died. It was very bad. But I'm trying to remember, I'm pretty sure it was Maedhros who spoke up and said, hey, that seems like a shitty thing to do. Here it is. Maedhros, the eldest of his sons, on a time, the friend of Fingon, spoke to Fëanor saying, shall we send back the boats, basically. So yeah, Maedhros was the one that spoke up and said, Dad, that's really shitty, don't do that. Will I be streaming Fata Morgana? Yes! It'll be a couple hours after this when I rest my throat, but we will definitely finish it today. Alright, so, Fingolfin's pissed at the sons, even though it really wasn't their bad, but, you know. Hey, Billy. You haven't missed too much. We're still going. So let's see, where was I? Then there was peril of strife between the hosts. But grievous as were the losses upon the road, the people of Fingolfin and of Finrod, son of Finarfin, were still more numerous than the followers of Fëanor. And these now withdrew before them and removed their dwelling to the southern shore, and the lake lay between them. Many of Fëanor's people indeed repented of the burning at Losgard, and were filled with amazement at the valor that had brought the friends whom they'd abandoned over the ice of the north, and they would have welcomed them, but dared not for shame. So, the two groups are kind of split up now. They're on either sides of a lake. Fëanor's group's on the south, Fingolfin's is on the north. Fëanor's group kind of feels bad, and also is kind of amazed that the other group made it, and obviously the other group is pissed, but especially Fingolfin is really upset and angry at the sons of Fëanor. Thus, because of the curse that lay upon them, the Noldor achieved nothing, while Morgoth hesitated, and the dread of light was new and strong upon the orcs. But Morgoth arose from thought, and seeing the division of his foes, he laughed. In the pits of Angband, he caused vast smokes and vapors to be made, and they came forth from the reeking tops of the Iron Mountains, and afar off they could be seen in Mithram, staining the bright airs in the first mornings of the world. A wind came out of the east and bore them over Hithlum, darkening the new sun, and they fell and coiled about the fields and hollows, and lay upon the waters of Mithram, drear and poisonous. Then Fingon the Valiant, son of Fingolfin, resolved to heal the feud that divided the Noldor, before their enemies should be ready for war. For the earth trembled in the Northlands with the thunder of the forges of Morgoth underground. Long before, in the bliss of Valinor, before Melkor was unchained or lies came between them, Fingon had been close in friendship with Maedhros, and though he knew not yet that Maedhros had not forgotten him at the burning of the ships, the thought of their ancient friendship stung his heart. Therefore he dared a deed which is justly renowned among the feats of the princes of Noldor. Alone, and without the counsel of any, he set forth in search of Maedhros, and aided by the very darkness that Morgoth had made, he came unseen into the fastness of his foes. High upon the shoulders of Thangorodrim he climbed, and looked in despair upon the desolation of the land, but no passage or crevice could he find through which he might come within Morgoth's stronghold. Then, in defiance of the orcs, who cowered still in the dark vaults beneath the earth, he took his harp and sang a song of Valinor that the Noldor made of old, before strife was born among the sons of Finwë, and his voice rang in the mournful hollows that had never before heard aught save cries of fear and woe. Thus Fingon found what he sought, for suddenly above him, far and faint, his song was taken up, and a voice answering called to him. Maedhros it was that sang amid his torment. But Fingon climbed to the foot of the precipice where his kinsman hung, and then could go no further, and he wept when he saw the cruel device of Morgoth. Maedhros, therefore, being in anguish without hope, begged Fingon to shoot him with his bow, and Fingon strung an arrow and bent his bow. And seeing no better hope, he cried to Manwë, saying, O king, to whom all birds are dear, speed now this feathered shaft, and recall some pity for the Noldor in their need. His prayer was answered swiftly. For Manwë, to whom all birds are dear, and to whom they bring news upon Tanaquil from Middle-earth, had sent forth the race of eagles, commanding them to dwell in the crags of the north and to keep watch upon Morgoth. For Manwë still had pity for the exiled elves, and the eagles brought news of much that passed in those days to the sad ears of Manwë. Now, even as Fingon bent his bow, there flew down from the airs Thorondor, king of eagles, mightiest of all birds that have ever been, whose outstretched wings spanned 30 fathoms, and staying Fingon's hand, he took him up and bore him to the face of the rock where Maedhros hung. But Fingon could not release the hell-wrought bond upon his wrist, nor sever it, nor draw it from the stone. Again, therefore, in his pain, Maedhros begged that he would slay him, but Fingon cut off his hand above the wrist, and Thorondor bore them back to Mithrin. So, yes, those two are probably the most popular ship in the Silmarillion canon. Everybody pairs those two together, because why wouldn't? They're reunited by the song. He climbed a mountain to save him. He was gonna kill him because Maedhros begs to be set free from his torment, and Fingon is so desperate to save him, he cries out to God, please, give me an answer. And Tolkien sends his answer, Deus ex birds. His favorite answer to any problem, birds. Whenever you have something you can't solve, send the birds! And so the eagle shows up and flies him up to where Maedhros is, and he still can't set him free from the cursed iron. And so Maedhros says, just kill me, just end my suffering. And instead he cuts his hand off, because that's where the thing he was hanging from his wrist. So he's managed to save Maedhros and take him down on the bird, on the Thorondor, and down to the place. And remember, these are the sons of the two separate kings who are rivals. So they literally have a Romeo and Juliet thing going on here, where Fingon left by himself to save Maedhros because, he loved him so much, even though he knew that they were basically enemies at this point, and his dad hates Maedhros. It's great. You could find so many works of fiction on these two that are really fantastic. So yeah, saved by birds. There Maedhros in time was healed, for the fire of life was hot within him, and his strength was of the ancient world, such as those possessed who were nurtured in Valinor. His body recovered from his torment and became hale, but the shadow of his pain was in his heart, and he lived to wield his sword with left hand, more deadly than his right had been. By this deed, Fingon won great renown, and all the Noldor praised him, and the hatred between the houses of Fingolfin and Fëanor was assuaged. For Maedhros begged forgiveness for the desertion in Ereman, and he waived his claim to kingship over all the Noldor, saying to Fingolfin, if there lay no grievance between us, lord, still the kinship would rightly come to you, the eldest here of the house of Finwë, and not the least wise. But to this, his brothers did not all in their heart agree. So the peace has been made, because Fingon saved Maedhros, and then Maedhros basically fell on his knees and apologized for what happened and said, you need to be the king, not me. Akatsuki, almost all the pairings in Lord of the Rings are basically Romeo and Juliet's, aren't they? Gimli and Legolas being another really big one. But, yeah, so Maedhros begs forgiveness. He says, Fingolfin, you deserve to be the king, and basically all is forgiven. For now, because problem is, Maedhros is a good guy. Not all of his brothers are good guys. I think only 3 of his brothers are good guys. I think 3 of the 7 can be considered good people, so there will be more problems. Therefore, even as Mandos foretold the house of Fëanor were called the Dispossessed, because the overlordship passed from it, the elder to the house of Fingolfin, both in Elendë and in Beleriand, and because also of the loss of the Silmarils. But the Noldor, being again united, set a watch upon the borders of Dor-Daedaloth, and Angband was beleaguered from the west, south, and east. And they sent forth messengers far and wide to explore the countries of Beleriand, and to treat with the people that dwelt there. So now Fingolfin's their ruler, they're all united, again, because of the love between Fingon and Maedhros, who are both so good. But Maedhros' brothers are douchebags. Now King Thingol welcomed not with a full heart the coming of so many princes in might out of the west, eager for new realms, and he would not open his kingdom, nor remove its girdle of enchantment, for wise with the wisdom of Melian, he trusted not that the restraint of Morgoth would endure. Alone of the princes of the Noldor, those of Finarfin's house were suffered to pass within the confines of Doriath, for they could claim close kinship with King Thingol, since their mother was Eowyn of Aqualande, Olway's daughter. Okay, so let's explain that. King Thingol is the guy that got married to the goddess lady. You remember they met in the woods and they fell in love and they stayed in Middle-earth and made their own cave kingdom. They have their own little cave kingdom and all their elves. It's magically sealed so no one can get inside it. And he sees all these fancy big elves coming from the west and he's like, I don't think this is good because they're all going to want kingdoms of their own. They're all going to be assholes and they're going to fight wars and stuff. So we're not going to let anybody in except these guys, because technically they're like my nephews twice removed. Because their mom was the daughter of Olway, and Olway was Thingol's brother, I think, is how that tracks. So distant relations-ish that he will let in. Otherwise, Thingol's like, fuck this shit. Y'all deal with yourselves. I'm out. Angrod, son of Finarfin, was the first of the exiles to come to Menegroth, which is his cave kingdom, messenger of his brother Finrod, and he spoke long with the king, telling him of the deeds of the Noldor in the north, and of their numbers, and of the ordering of their force. But being true and wise-hearted, and thinking all griefs now forgiven, he spoke no word concerning the kinslaying, nor the manner of the exile of the Noldor and the oath of Fëanor. King Thingol hearkened to the word of Angrod, and ere he went he said to him, Thus shall you speak for me to those that sent you. In Hithlum the Noldor have leave to dwell, and in the highlands of Dorthonion, and in the lands east of Doriath that are empty and wild. But elsewhere there are many of my people, and I would not have them restrained of their freedom, still less ousted from their homes. Beware, therefore, how you princes of the west bear yourselves, for I am Lord of Beleriand, and all who seek to dwell there shall hear my word. Into Doriath none shall come to abide, but only such as I call guests, or who seek me in great need. So, King Thingol has said, you guys can stay. But you can only stay in these places where my folks don't live, because I'm not kicking them out. And Angrod, the guy that came and spoke to him, didn't tell him everything. Not out of malice, but out of not considering the importance of telling him that there were murders. He just didn't think about how it was probably important for him to know about the murders. You know how you forget sometimes to tell people about how you did a murder? Now the lords of the Noldor held council in Mithram, and thither came Angrod out of Doriath, bearing the message of King Thingol. Cold seemed its welcome to the Noldor, and the sons of Fëanor were angered at his words. But Maedhros laughed, saying, A king is he that can hold his own, or his title is vain. Thingol does but grant us lands where his power does not run. Indeed, Doriath alone would be his realm this day, but for the coming of the Noldor. Therefore in Doriath let him reign, and be glad. Okay, I think I'm being summoned. I will be right back. Ah. Hello? So, once again, Maedhros is proving he's the only good person in this family, and doesn't get mad when Thingol says, hey, you guys can't live wherever you want, because obviously Thingol was there first, and Maedhros is like, yeah, that's fair. But Caranthir, one of his brothers, who loved not the sons of Finarfin and was the harshest of the brothers and most quick to anger, cried aloud, yea, more, let not the sons of Finarfin run hither and thither with their tails to this dark elf in his caves. Who made them our spokesman to deal with him? And though they come indeed to Beleriand, let them not so swiftly forget that their father is a lord of the Noldor, though their mother be of other kin. So, Thingolfin will only let his kinsmen, the Finarfin family, come say hey. So Finarfin's family come say hey, and they come out and have a message, and Maedhros is like, yeah, that's fair, cool. And his brothers are like, fuck this shit. Why should they be able to speak with us? Why should this king be able to tell us what to do? Fuck this shit. We should be in charge, because they're all idiots. Then Angrod, which is the messenger, was wrathful and went forth from the council. Maedhros indeed rebuked Caranthir, but the greater part of the Noldor of both followings, hearing his words, were troubled in heart, fearing the fell spirits of the sons of Fëanor that it seemed would ever be like to burst forth in rash word or violence. But Maedhros restrained his brothers, and they departed from the council, and soon afterwards they left Mithram and went eastward beyond Eros to the wide lands about the hill of Himring. So in other words, the sons of Fëanor have one brain cell, and that brain cell is Maedhros. That's it. The rest are idiots. That region was named thereafter the March of Maedhros, for northwards there was little defense of hill or river against assault from Angband. There Maedhros and his brothers kept watch, gathering all such people as would come to them, and they had few dealings with their kinsfolk westward, save at need. It is said, indeed, that Maedhros himself devised this plan to lessen the chances of strife, and because he was very willing that the chief peril of assault should fall upon him, and he remained for his part in friendship with the houses of Fingolfin and Finarfin, and would come among them at times for common counsel. Yet he also was bound by the oath, though it slept now for a time. What he's done is he took his family, his troublemakers, his idiots, and they left the main camp of the elves to go forward to where there's a pass that connects Morgoth's land to where they are, and they are now camping at the pass, basically the first line of defense, because Maedhros feels it's their responsibility as Fëanor's family to not endanger others if they can, and because also his family keeps causing problems, so he says, let's head out of here. But he's still friends with everybody, personally. His brothers, not so much, but he's still friends with the others. Now the people of Caranthir dwelt furthest east beyond the upper waters of Gelion, above Lake Helivorn, under Mount Rurir, and to the southward, and they climbed the heights of Eredluin and looked eastward in wonder, for wild and wide it seemed to them were the lands of Middle-earth. Thus it was Caranthir's people came upon the dwarves, who after the onslaught of Morgoth and the coming of the Noldor had ceased their traffic into Beleriand. But though either people loved skill and were eager to learn, no great love was there between them, for the dwarves were secret and quick to resentment, and Caranthir was haughty and scarce concealed his scorn for the unloveliness of the Nalgrim, and his people followed their lord. Nevertheless, since both peoples feared and hated Morgoth, they made alliance, and had of it great profit, for the Nalgrim learned many secrets of crafts in those days, so that the smiths and mansions of the Nogrod and Belagost became renowned among their kin, and when the dwarves began again to journey into Beleriand, all the traffic of the dwarf mines passed first through the hands of Caranthir, and thus great riches came to him. So the asshole brother, Caranthir, who's like a douchebag, he sets up his little family clan. Each of the 7 brothers basically has their own little family clan. He sets up his group close to where the dwarves are, and they kind of make an alliance, even though it's not very friendly, because he's a douchebag. But because of it, he becomes very rich and powerful. When 20 years of the sun had passed, Fingolfin, king of the Noldor, made a great feast, and it was held in the spring near to the pools of Irvin, whence the swift river Nerog rose, for there the lands were green and fair, at the feet of the mountains of shadow that shielded them from the north. The joy of that feast was long remembered in later days of sorrow, and it was called Merith Ederthad, the Feast of Reuniting. Thither came many of the chieftains and people of Fingolfin and Finrod, and of the sons of Fëanor, Maedhros and Maglor, with warriors of the Eastern March. And there came also great numbers of the Grey Elves, wanderers of the woods of Beleriand and the folks of the Havens, with Círdan their lord. There even came green elves from Assyriand, the land of seven rivers, far off under the walls of the Blue Mountains. But out of Doriath there came but two messengers, Mablung and Darin, bearing greetings from the king. So they're having a big old party. The only people that come from the Secret Cave Kingdom are two messengers. The king does not come. The only people that come from Fëanor's side are Maedhros and Maglor, because they don't suck. Everybody else sucks. And so they're having this great party. At Merith Aderthod, many counsels were taken in goodwill, and oaths were sworn of league and friendship. And it is told that at this feast the tongue of the Grey Elves was most spoken even by the Noldor, for they learned swiftly the speech of Beleriand, whereas the Sindar were slow to master the tongue of Valinor. The hearts of the Noldor were high and full of hope, and to many among them it seemed that the words of Fëanor had been justified, bidding them seek freedom and fair kingdoms in Middle-earth. And indeed there followed after long years of peace, while their swords fenced Beleriand from the ruin of Morgoth, and his power was shut behind his gates. In those days there was joy beneath the new sun and moon, and all the land was glad, but still the shadow brooded in the north. And when again 30 years had passed, Turgon, son of Fingolfin, left Nevrast, where he dwelt, and sought out Finrod, his friend, upon the Isle of Tol Sirion. Tol Sirion, not cereal. And they journeyed southward, along the river, being weary for a while of the northern mountains. And as they journeyed, night came upon them beyond the mares of twilight, beside the rivers of Sirion. And they slept upon his banks beneath the summer stars. But Ulmo, coming up the river, laid a deep sleep upon them in heavy dreams. Ulmo being the water god, remember? And the trouble of the dreams remained after they awoke, but neither said aught to the other, for their memory was not clear, and each believed Ulmo had sent a message to him alone. But unquiet was upon them ever after, and doubt of what should befall, and they wandered often alone in untrodden lands, seeking far and wide for places of hidden strength. For it seemed to each that he was bidden to prepare for a day of evil, and to establish a retreat lest Morgoth should burst from Angband and overthrow the armies of the north. Hey, Joe. So, basically they've just been warned by Ulmo that shit's gonna get real, and they should make a hideaway, a secret place for them to escape. Now, on a time, Finrod and Galadriel, his sister, were the guests of Thingol, their kinsman in Doriath. Then Finrod was filled with wonder at the strength and majesty of Menegroth, its treasuries and armories, and its many-pillared halls of stone. And it came into his heart that he would build wide halls behind ever-guarded gates in some deep and secret place beneath the hills. Therefore he opened his heart to Thingol, telling him of his dreams. And Thingol spoke to him of the deep gorge of the river Narog, and the caves under the high Ferrith in its steep western shore. And when he departed, he gave him guides to lead him to that place of which few yet knew. There Finrod came to the caverns of Narog, and began to establish there deep halls and armories after the fashion of the mansions of Menegroth. And that stronghold was called Nagathrond. In that labor Finrod was aided by the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, and they were rewarded well, for Finrod had brought more treasures out of Tirion than any of the other princes of the Noldor. In that time was made for him the Naglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, most renowned of their work in the elder days. It was a carcanet of gold, and set therein were gems uncounted from Valinor, but it had a power within so that it rested lightly on its wearer as a strand of flax, and whatsoever neck it clasped, it sat always with grace and loveliness. You think that thing's gonna cause problems? There in Nagathrond, Finrod made his home with many of his people, and he was named in the tongue of the dwarves Felagund, hewer of caves, and that name he bore thereafter to his end. But Finrod Felagund was not the first to dwell in the caves beside the river Narog. So other words, Finrod and his bro, or not his bro, was it cousin? Turgon? Turgon, son of Fingolfin, with his friend. Okay, so no, they're friends. Finrod and Turgon, they go south because they're traveling, and they have dreams next to this river about how shit's gonna go bad. And both of them are like, well, fuck, we gotta do something. And the answer is always, build a cave. Bad times are coming, build a cave. So Finrod speaks to Thingol because he already has his cave kingdom, and he's like, hey, I want to make a cave kingdom. And he says, here, there's a cool place for a cave kingdom. And so he goes, and the dwarves help him build Nagathrond, which will be an important place in later stories. And Nagathrond is basically another secret cave hideaway of the elves. A lot of the cities in this era are going to be hidden and hard to find because otherwise Morgoth would just kick the shit out of everybody. And obviously, eventually, the tragedy will be that somebody finds it and shit goes down. The Noglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, turns out to be behind a lot of the troubles that come up in this story and in later ones, like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It will not be mentioned much directly, but if you actually know what's going on, then you know what the problem is. In The Hobbit, in the extended version of the movies, and also in the books, the reason that... Well, I don't know if the books completely confirm this, or if it's just... I'm pretty sure it's at least implied. Legolas's dad has problems with the dwarves because the dwarves were supposed to give him Noglamir, and they didn't, because they're jerks, and they want to keep everything. But what really... Okay, the one guy was a jerk. What's his face? The grandpa was a jerk. And so the reason that the elves from the woods hated the dwarves in The Hobbit so much was because of this broken promise. But anyway, that comes up thousands of years later, after the Noglamir passes through a half dozen hands. Everybody's always trying to get their hands on this jewelry. Okay, so Fingon built his secret cave place. Galadriel, his sister, went not with him to Nagathron, for in Doriath dwelt Celeborn, kinsman of Thingol, and there was great love between them. Therefore she remained in the hidden kingdom and abode with Melian, and of her learned great lore and wisdom concerning Middle-earth. But Turgon remembered the city set upon a hill, Tirion the Fair with its tower and tree, and he found not what he sought, but returned to Nevrast, and sat in peace in Vinemar by the shores of the sea. And then in the next year, Ulmo himself appeared to him, and bade him go forth again alone into the Vale of Sirion. And Turgon went forth, and by the guidance of Ulmo, discovered the hidden vale of Tumladen in the encircling mountains, in the midst of which there was a hill of stone. Of this he spoke to none as yet, but returned once more to Nevrast, and began in his secret council to devise the plan of a city after the manner of Tirion upon Tuna, for which his heart yearned in exile. So Ulmo, the ocean god, shows Turgon, the other guy that had dreams, about this secret place that would be a great place for a secret kingdom. It's like surrounded by mountains, so you can never find it. There's only one secret path that leads in there, so he's making plans to build a city there. Now Morgoth, believing the reports of his spies that the lords of the Noldor were wandering abroad with little thought of war, made trial of the strength and watchfulness of his enemies. Once more, with little warning, his might was stirred, and suddenly there were earthquakes in the north, and fire came from fissures in the earth, and the iron mountains vomited flame, and orcs poured forth across the plains of Ardgalan. Thence they thrust down the path of Sirion in the west, and in the east they burst through the lands of Maglor, in the gap between the hills of Maedhros and the outliers of the Blue Mountains. But Fingolfin and Maedhros were not sleeping, and while others sought out the scattered band of orcs that strayed in Beleriand and did great evil, they came upon the main host from either side as it was assaulting Dorthonion. And they defeated the servants of Morgoth, and pursuing them across Ardgalan, destroyed them utterly to the least and last, within sight of Angband's gates. That was the third great battle of the wars of Beleriand, and it was named Dagor Aglareb, the Glorious Battle. A victory it was, and yet a warning, and the princes took heed of it, and thereafter drew closer their leaguer, and strengthened and ordered their watch, setting the siege of Angband, which lasted well nigh 400 years of the sun. For a long time after Dagor Aglareb, no servant of Morgoth would venture from his gates, for they feared the lords of the Noldor. And Fingolfin boasted that save by treason among themselves, Morgoth could never again burst from the leaguer of the Eldar, nor come upon them at unawares. Yet the Noldor could not capture Angband, nor could they regain the Silmarils, and war never wholly ceased in all that time of the siege, for Morgoth devised new evils, and ever and anon he would make trial of his enemies. Nor could the stronghold of Morgoth be ever wholly encircled, for the Iron Mountains, from whose great curving wall the towers of Thangorodrim were thrusted forward, defended it upon either side, and were impassable to the Noldor because of their snow and ice. Thus, in his rear and to the north, Morgoth had no foes, and by that way his spies at times went out and came by devious routes into Beleriand. And desiring above all to sow fear and disunion among the elves, he commanded the orcs to take alive any of them that they could and bring them bound to Angband, and some he so daunted by the terror of his eyes that they needed chains no more, but walked ever in fear of him, doing his will wherever they might be. Thus Morgoth learned much of all that had befallen since the rebellion of Fëanor, and he rejoiced, seeing therein the seed of many dissensions among his foes. So, Melkor tries to take him by surprise, and they manage to throw him off, and they surround the front of his fortress and basically build a wall, sort of like a camp, an encampment. And, they, are like, fuck you, we're gonna hang out here, and you're never gonna take us by surprise again. Unfortunately, they can't circle around the entire mountain, and so his spies are still able to go out and find out things, and he is learning secrets that he's going to use to turn them against each other. When nearly 100 years had run since the Dagor Algareb, Morgoth endeavored to take Fingolfin at unawares, for he knew of the vigilance of Maedhros. And he sent forth an army into the White North, and they turned west and again south, and came down the coasts to the Firth of Drengist, and by the route that Fingolfin followed from the grinding ice. Thus they would enter into the realm of Hithlum from the west, but they were espied in time, and Fingon fell upon them among the hills at the head of the Firth, and most of the orcs were driven into the sea. This was not reckoned among the great battles, for the orcs... For the orcs were not in great number, and only a part of the people of Hithlum fought there. But thereafter there was peace for many years, and no open assault from Angband, for Morgoth perceived now that the orcs unaided were no match for the Noldor, and he sought in his heart for new counsel. Ooh, it's fun that Akatsuki mentioned dragons! Again, after 100 years, Glaurung, first of the Uruk-loki, the fire drakes of the north, issued from Angband's gates by night. He was yet young and scarce half grown, for long and slow is the life of the dragons. But the elves fled before him to Eredwethin and Dorthonion in dismay, and he defiled the fields of Erdgalan. Then Fingon, prince of Hithlum, rode against him with archers on horseback, and hemmed him round with a ring of swift riders. And Glaurung could not endure their darts, being not yet come to his full armory, and he fled back to Angband, and came not forth again for many years. Fingon won great praise, and the Noldor rejoiced, for few saw the full meaning and threat of this new thing. But Morgoth was ill-pleased that Glaurung had disclosed himself over soon, and after his defeat there was the long peace of well-nigh 200 years. In all that time there were but affrays on the marches, and all Beleriand prospered and grew rich. Behind the guard of their armies in the north, the Noldor built their dwellings and their towers, and many fair things they made in those days, and poems and histories and books of lore. In many parts of the land, the Noldor and the Sindar became welded into one people and spoke the same tongue, though this difference remained between them, that the Noldor had the greater power of mind and body, were the mightier warriors and sages, and they built with stone, loved the hill slopes and open lands. But the Sindar had the fairer voices and were more skilled in music, save only Maglor, son of Fëanor, and they loved the woods and the riversides, and some of the grey elves still wandered far and wide without settling abode, and they sang as they went. So, he realized that the orcs were not enough, that he was not winning just by throwing orcs at the elves. So he takes 100 years to make a dragon. The dragon is still a baby, so it does not win. But he has dragons now, which is not going to bode well for anyone, that he now has dragons, and there will be dragons in future wars. The elves really have not realized how bad this is going to be for them when he has an army of full-grown dragons, but they will, eventually. They will realize how horrible that's going to be. We're going to quit there, since I do have to do a good bit of reading later tonight when we go back to Fata Morgana. We've done a lot of fun stuff today. We finally got Maedros and Fingon together, which is delightful, and they've started building more of their fancy cave kingdoms, which will be important later. So we're getting into the meat of it. Thanks for joining me. We'll be back Wednesday and continue reading then. Fata Morgana will probably be at about 3, maybe 4, depending, because I have quite a bit I need to get done today, but I'll keep y'all posted and hope to see you then. Bye.